Hello everyone, this is Fionapollo and I do art commentary. If I sound a little Marge Simpson-y today, it's because I'm recovering from a throat infection. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Laughter is pain. Today, I wanted to look into the world of disabled characterization in media and interpretations of disabled characters within internet spaces. This topic came up following an odd call-out post on twitter.hell, naturally, and yes, I am going to keep calling it Twitter, where someone accused an artist of having an obsession with disabled characters and called their moral character into question over it. The reason it was odd is because the piece they used to reinforce their point was seemingly harmless. It didn't have any trace of some kind of mature intent or anything like that, and the person who did the call out was promptly called out themselves for jumping to conclusions. I'm not going to get too into the specifics of the whole situation because the person who made the call out was a minor and all of that apparently, but that's more or less the gist of what happened. But with that said, it also raised quite a few valid concerns and discussions surrounding how people both view disabled characters in media and even disabled people in real life. It's not uncommon for disabilities to be reduced to such works, and popular media often doesn't help with that. Certain types of disabilities are also represented quite oddly in media. Approximately 16% of the human population are significantly disabled in some shape or form, whether that be physically or mentally. However, do note that this statistic may be significantly higher due to a lot of ignorance and stigma surrounding mental disabilities in particular. For reference, people living on the European continent take up approximately 11% of the population, and while I can't personally verify what exactly counts as significantly disabled, you would think that with such a statistic, we would see a lot more of them in fiction than we do currently, and probably under much more favourable interpretations. But media, despite the best efforts of some good eggs in the industry, isn't always an idealised paradise for everyone, and the reduction and infantilization of physical disability, as well as both the romanticisation and sensationalism of mental disability, can be a very glaring example of this. There are still some really amazing examples of positive disabled rep, which we will discuss, but often these depictions also have a heavy hand in how people can view individuals with these traits and characteristics online and in the real world, despite what some may try to argue. Even positive portrayals can be done poorly or have negative connotations outside of fiction. So, let's look into it. If you like what you're hearing, then please consider liking and subscribing. I focus a lot on animation news, fandom culture, and some of the psychology behind why certain online behaviours develop. If any of that piques your interest, then please check out some of my other stuff. I promise you, my voice sounds a lot better in other videos. Please note that the majority of what I say in my videos is purely speculative unless evidence is provided to state otherwise. I'm not a mental health or disability expert, just some idiot with a microphone, and this video should not be used to speak above the voices of actual disabled individuals. Anyway, let's dive in. Part 1. Disability in motion. So to try and break down this perception of disabled people in our minds, let's first take a look at the general picture of how they are depicted in media and go from there. We're going to kind of split this section into physical and mental disabilities because the reception can differ between the two despite some overlap. And because I more so focus on cartoons and anything animated, yes, we will be mostly focusing on that type of media as opposed to live action shows, but there will be some mentioned. Disability is a very tricky thing in media. A lot of it veers on the ableist idea of fixing disability rather than accommodating it and showing compassion for people's differences. It very much falls in line with the pre-existing notion across many parts of the world that imperfections or outliers must be cast out by society, which doesn't really help to bridge a meaningful sense of understanding on a larger scale. Depictions of physical and mental disabilities can also garner some pretty different reactions from the general audience. Physical tends to mostly draw sympathy or pity, but you still want to root for them since they can often represent this kind of underdog character who wins against the odds, whereas mental disabilities, depending on severity, are viewed as unstable or unnerving, which causes suspicion or even hostility. A lot of stigma towards mental health and invisible disabilities can stem from exposure to ableist media because of this being such a prevalent issue. One such way being the manifestation of the insane villain trope. So I went ahead and asked my audience if they could think of any good or bad examples of disabled rep that I can use for some examples, and as always, you guys came through with some really fab recommendations. I did also notice though that the recommendations kind of reinforced my point too, so let's take a look. On the physical side, we have characters like Finn the Human from Adventure Time, Toph Beifong from Avatar The Last Airbender, Hiccup from How to Train Your Dragon, Linkso from the Thundercats TV show, Edward Elric from Full Metal Alchemist, Guts from Berserk, Daredevil, General Amaya from The Dragon Prince, and Ida from Owl House. And an incredibly interesting one that was apparently shown in early concepts but then got scrapped is Felix/Adrian from Miraculous Ladybug. According to one person, looking at his early concept art, he was originally intended to have a cane. I never knew that, but for the most part, these characters were noted as being the good examples. Pretty much every single character listed here is shown in-universe to have adapted to their own personal circumstances, and despite some challenges that their disabilities might present, they are still able to prove themselves to be kind or interesting people, competent fighters, problem solvers, etc. Like pretty much everything in a story, elements of a character's design are chosen to serve the narrative, and this can include disability. Take Finn, for example. About halfway through Adventure Time, he loses his arm, which then goes through a series of changes meant to reflect Finn's personal journey. And this can even be interpreted as showing how Finn's own thoughts around what a hero looks like changes over time. His arm does magically grow back at one point with the grass sword, which is unfortunately a common thing with disability rep. One annoying trope is when they are magically cured and all that sweet development garnered from their disability feels almost nullified. But then shortly after, he loses his arm again and gains a robot arm. And I feel like this can be seen as a pretty subtle way of simulating the event of picking out a prosthetic limb. Sometimes people can opt for something more organic looking to resemble a real limb, or you can get more creative. If we want to look at someone who has already accepted their disability and found a way to live happily with it, but has to prove it to other people, Toph in Avatar actively fights against being babied by her parents and infantilized for being blind, reflecting how disabled people are treated in real life. Despite how beloved Toph is, she does have that questionable element of treating disabilities as superpowers, considering she is regarded in-universe as one of the most powerful earthbenders because of how she uses it in conjunction with her blindness. It's a bit of a tricky thing because that doesn't really negate that she is good rep, but it's a trope that often happens a lot with minority characters in general. In Harry Potter, for example, all of Ron's heroic moments in the books got transferred to Hermione in the movies. The 2000s had this weird thing about making girls like super cool and super self-reliant and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. The whole not like other girls kind of trope as a way to overcompensate for low opinions of specific people like girls. But the caveat to this is that they made her pretty much superhuman, and I'm kind of glad that stories and characters have been allowed to move away from that. Also, please don't slam me for using Harry Potter as an example. Hermione might not be considered like a marginalized character now, but girl characters were very much of a low opinion back in those days. I do also just want to shine a spotlight in this section for the anime examples given as well. From Guts in Berserk to several characters in One Piece, I noticed that a lot of the disabled characters recommended in anime for this topic were amputees, which takes on a different meaning as far as rep is concerned. This type of disability is commonly used right off the bat as a narrative device used to derive sympathy. That's not always a bad thing, but too much of this trope can instigate some harmful connotations, such as people not really understanding that people born without certain limbs may not necessarily feel that same sense of loss as someone who is actually an amputee, and they can almost view them as someone mourning a lost part of themselves instead of seeing people as a whole person within their own right despite any missing limbs. I think a reason for it might be because Japan isn't especially diverse, leading to a heightened use of such things like disability to be used purely to drive narratives in media, whereas in the West, places like the US being such a melting pot of cultures and identities creates a demand for more honest depictions of various people existing in media outside of the need to drive the narrative. And this can very much be said for mental disabilities as well as physical. In connection with this, other negative examples of physical disability include those that are miraculously cured as a way to give the characters a happy ending. This is bad for both physical and mental disabilities, but is even more preposterous on the physical side because of how much more, well, physical those disabilities are. Medically speaking, sometimes these things are just straight up impossible and can take you out of the moment. With that, looking at the mental side of the discussion now, mentally disabled characters mentioned included Jinx from Arcane, BoJack Horseman, Entraptor from She-Ra, Norma Khan from Dead End Paranormal Park, Symmetra from Overwatch, Violet Evergarden, and Donatello from TMNT. And I'd like you all to just take a moment and have a think about all of those characters I just listed. If you know them and their stories, do you notice any kind of pattern when it comes to their portrayals on screen? I'll help you out. Of all the characters with mental disabilities listed, the only ones with any kind of positive or neutral portrayals are the ones with autism. And by positive or neutral, I'm not talking about honest representation, I'm just talking about whether they are seen as positive characters. Every other character is noted within their own story to often be a bad person who hurts others. And this is extremely important and relevant because while that at first may seem like like an outright bad thing, it's actually a bit more complicated. Mental health is messy, and it can be really bad, especially for the person involved and the people around them, which can foster a lot of bad situations and circumstances. But the issue with media is that it can exaggerate or home in on the bad parts a lot more, because who wants to watch a normal run-of-the-mill conflict that doesn't escalate? That doesn't make for good entertainment, but at the expense of that entertainment, we end up with these portrayals that target people who are mentally ill and are often among society's most vulnerable individuals. What also doesn't help with this is that the illnesses these characters experience are almost never explicitly mentioned by name, so people are left to often interpret what the real-world counterpart to these characters' struggles actually are, and this in turn makes it all the more difficult for the audience to see it as something legitimate, and not just a made-up illness that's been created for the narrative. We also can't forget that the majority of the general audience will view things in a very black and white manner, especially those who have never experienced mental illness before. So more complex interpretations aren't always viewed favourably, and instead only the bad traits will be picked up on. Even though we see the culmination of why characters like Jinx and Bojack may become the way they are, there's this weird atmosphere around mental illness in fiction where the illness is only ever acknowledged in relation to a shift in the character's moral conduct towards the negative. I don't think I have any positive examples off the top of my head of where a perceived good character has a psychotic episode and still comes out of it being perceived as a good person. It's like people are waiting for them to crack and walk over to the dark side, and it's honestly kind of messed up. I think the only positive example I have of mental illness that isn't autism or anxiety is probably Ice King from Adventure Time, who is an almost perfect allegory for a person suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. Despite his perceived insanity, as the story progresses and people become more acutely aware of his condition, he is more readily accepted and respected while still being corrected when it comes to kidnapping princesses. But even then, he also falls into the trope of being cured in the end. Ice King is rescued from the effects of the Ice Crown and reverts back to his original identity, Simon Petrikov. And this culture surrounding mental disability in media can also be a very negative experience for autistic characters too. Autism, ADHD, and other similar disorders are very often infantilized by people who don't really understand them. Even if people may not treat them as dangerous like they would with schizophrenia, for example, they can still write off such characters as annoying or immature. Some very glaring examples of bad autism rep in media has popped up in recent months are cases like Sean Murphy from The Good Doctor and Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. And a common one that was suggested by my audience as far as animated shows went happened to be Sheen from Jimmy Neutron. And that's not to say that some people don't behave the way that these characters do, because they absolutely exist. But the way autism is portrayed in live action especially is something that really pushes me away from such shows, because general TV has a habit of digging its heels into one type of trope and sticking to it with very little room for nuance. Though I will say, probably the best example of an autistic character I have ever seen who is more on the high support side and who isn't portrayed as an antagonist, at least until they decide to wreck his character in season 3, is Harlem from The Umbrella Academy. That said, autism-coded characters have been cropping up a lot more in recent years and have received much more favourable receptions and interpretations, particularly in animated media, and that is largely in part due to how autism has become better understood in real time. It's quite fascinating, really. But anyway, that's a general overview of my thoughts on disability portrayed in media. There's a hell of a lot more I can say, but alas, my throat hurts and we need to keep it moving. Part 2. Fandom and Paternalism. Content warning for discussions of sexual themes. Moving on, let's get into what the crux of this topic is about. It's no secret that people have become much more aware of hypersexuality both in media and on the internet. Just as an FYI, this will mostly pertain to visible disabilities, but we will have a bit of a discussion on the mental and invisible side further in. After the 90s/2000s, where sexual liberation was at its peak and beginning to clash with the growing sentiment of people not wanting to have to be sexualized to feel empowered, some, especially the younger crowd who grew up during this kind of culture clash, have taken to actively trying to reduce or even suppress depictions of hypersexuality in their own ways. People have become hyper-aware of how easy and subtle it can be for an art piece to be created for or be interpreted as fetish art. It's gotten to the point where some have become paranoid of drawing certain things and attracting the wrong kind of attention, such as, for example, fat characters being over-sexualized, leading to people feeling uneasy about drawing them. This is also very prevalent in people just flat out refusing to draw feet. Feet is like one of those topics where you honestly truly cannot tell if there's some kind of underlying intent going on there, and it's pretty much the norm to even incorporate the choice to not draw things like toes, especially in a lot of aesthetics, because it makes it easier. For one thing, feet can be just as difficult as hands to get right, but also because people feel very strongly about either hating feet or wanting to avoid bringing in that kind of attention, or sometimes even both. Even I'm kind of weird about it. I hate feet, but I also know that they would be useful to learn, but I also know that drawing feet can either attract the wrong crowd or have people assume I'm a member of that crowd. It's very weird. It's a weird kind of rock and hard place situation, you know? Outside of the whole feet thing, this has also ended up stemming into people getting harassed for drawing physically disabled characters and being accused of only depicting them for fetishistic purposes. It can be really hard to detect sometimes when something is a fetish piece, especially when the subject matter doesn't appear sexual in nature, but a telltale sign will often be that an account focuses on a very specific subject matter and posts that subject matter almost exclusively. The sad reality is that certain types of people, particularly marginalised people, are often subject to this kind of attention, which obviously isn't great. But with all of that in mind, when someone who, for example, is a member of a marginalised group and chooses to draw characters similar to them, sometimes we end up with situations such as the one that spawned this entire situation. Someone else who is already on the defensive about hypersexuality and fetish art notices a pattern of someone who draws a specific subject matter almost exclusively, the alarm bells start ringing in their head, and before you know it, a call-out post has been made, and people are remarking at how gross the piece is or how weird the person is for drawing certain characters in a supposedly sexual manner, even if there is no sexual connotation in the pieces themselves. Which, by the way, full disclosure, the piece was just a collage of characters with amputated limbs and disability aids. There was not a single incriminating thing present on the piece itself, which made the whole debacle seem so much weirder. I've heard conflicting things on whether or not they were actually correct in their assumption in the specific instance I'm referring to, but it still ended up sparking an interesting discussion nonetheless. Why did someone automatically assume that the piece was fetish art? And maybe more importantly, taking fetishistic intentions out of the equation, why is it such a terrifying thing that members of a specific group are seen as desirable when that typically isn't the norm? It's perfectly normal for people to draw characters within suggestive context just for the purpose of portraying a character as attractive, but when it's a disabled character, suddenly it causes an uproar? That doesn't exactly sound fair. Beauty should be in the eye of the beholder. You don't have to be the beauty standard to be viewed as attractive, and that seems to be what caused a significant portion of this debate. But with all of that said, while it may be all well and good having me sit here as a perfectly able-bodied person discussing this, it's not exactly reflective of what some people living with physical disability might see within the discussion. So I decided to reach out to a fellow YouTuber called Oakwyrm, who regularly discusses the topic of disability within various media. Oakwyrm was kind enough to chat with me and stated the following: there's this common idea when people have a paternalistic view of disabled people that we're all innocent and childlike and need defending, which makes anything even remotely sexual that includes us even more worthy of pearl clutching than usual. In tandem with this, the idea that disability is inherently tragic means disability becomes negative in their minds, which further leads to confusion around the idea that any disabled person could ever be happy with their body or enjoy it in any way. Because obviously, we wouldn't, since we're all suffering miserable existences 24/7 and should be praised and fawned over for having the bravery to exist. All of this, in combination with the fact that there are people who sexualize disability, means some people might be more on guard about fetish art in regards to us than they really need to be. Also, drawing a sexy disabled person isn't inherently fetishistic in the first place, just like drawing any marginalized person being sexy isn't inherently fetishistic. There are layers of context that might make it so, but as a start point, disabled person who is sexy is not something to cry fetish art over, and it's frankly weird to do so, because we're people. We're allowed to be sexy if we want to. And honestly, I couldn't agree more. If you want to hear more of Oak's thoughts on topics to do with disability, I would highly recommend their channel. I will make sure to leave links to all of their socials in the description below. I personally find it really difficult not to assume that the same people who might say that disabilities are unattractive or that disabled people can't like themselves are very likely the same people who would say this about fat people, trans people, non-white people, and pretty much any other demographic you can think of. And as well as that, there is this really bizarre culture of encouraging the sense of loathing. And I don't only mean with disabled people, they just happen to be a really obvious case. But what I mean is that it seems to be a very popular trope, especially in fanfiction of all things, for characters to lament their unconventional features only for someone else to to swoop in like, well, I think you're worthy of respect, despite this very obvious thing that is supposed to be framed as a flaw for some reason. And I'm not saying that you should never write stuff like this. It can be impactful in small doses. But man, people can just like themselves and how they look, whether you have a missing limb or in a wheelchair or what, you know? It's honestly no different to someone thinking they're ugly for having a hooked nose or something. It's just, you know, it's a body feature. It can be attractive, and anyone can find it attractive. Self-loathing is nothing new. It's been around forever, whether it be minority groups, subcultures, etc. But the thing with the internet is that it can just make things seem a lot more abundant than what they actually might be, which is frustrating. But even still, I think it's important to look into and evaluate. The way that people deal with those feelings often changes with different generations, and as we've just gone into the perceptions around physical disability, I do just want to take a look at this from the mental health side, because not only does it seem to be almost expected, it's even encouraged within certain parts of the community itself. It's kind of become a meme in recent years to use autism, OCD, ADHD, and a few other spectrum-based disorders for clout online, and you know, I've definitely used my own suspected autism as a joke or a meme from time to time, but something I've at least noticed with myself is that sometimes I get into the mindset of hating myself and blaming it on my mental health instead of trying to actively change my mindset or be otherwise proactive to try and fight the issue. It's a really strange situation that I have seen reflected on TikTok a lot lately, especially with younger people who are still figuring things out, and to be honest, it reminds me a lot of how there was this obsession back in the 2000s in alternative circles with girls positively hating themselves, regardless of actual appearance, because they were depressed or anxious, but didn't have the terminology for it yet. So instead, they craved external validation, and that was very much romanticized in TV shows, movies, young adult novels, and so on. There's this almost masochistic fascination with both physically and mentally disabled people showing nothing but contempt for their own existence as a way for other able-bodied, mentally stable individuals to swoop in and feed into that behaviour so that the disabled person has someone to cling to, often to the point where some find it to be a marker for attractiveness almost. And this really didn't help with situations of the time, such as making sure girls especially didn't fall victim to predators. It's an extremely parasocial dynamic, and I'm quite glad that younger generations aren't repeating these behaviours in the same way we did when I was younger. But even with that, embracing mental illness and encouraging it in unhealthy ways and brushing it off as awareness, tolerance, or acceptance isn't that healthy either. Romanticization and fetishism can be tricky subjects in these regards. It's not only hard to tell when it's happening, but it can also be difficult to find your way out of it, especially when you're stuck in the middle, either trying to just draw some art for yourself or wanting validation that you aren't hated by everyone. It's hard, but it's not unwinnable. It just takes a bit of practice and understanding on everyone's part to be willing to meet in the middle. Part 3. Understanding the pattern. Overall, I think I can see the clear pipeline of how this situation developed and why. Portrayals of both physically and mentally disabled representation, even when done with good intentions and achieved well, can still be paved with some unintentional and sometimes unavoidable connotations in other ways, and this can also be different for every single individual on the planet. No two people are going to see something in the exact same way and can either interpret these as positive or negative. That, combined with other concerns regarding how certain groups are presented and treated, especially considering some fetish works or some fetish artists have a reputation of being quite manipulative or deceitful to get others to play into what they want, created this environment of hostility and hyper-awareness that culminated in a potential misfire. This then ultimately led to an evaluation of the whole circumstance, and the need to assert that yes, sometimes a person's disability can be fetishized, and there can be many reasons for this both on the side of the person themselves and the other people, but then there is also the argument that a person should be allowed to find themselves attractive and indulge in that from time to time without having their identity tied so closely with negative perceptions that the piece being secretly a fetish work is the only conclusion that could make sense. Like Oakwyrm said, the inherent idea of a tragedy behind disability can really hinder able-bodied people's ability to understand that you can have a fulfilling, happy life despite such perceived disadvantages. And I think with how much more harshly people are being towards themselves in recent years thanks to factors like social media, it would greatly benefit many to just stop and try to find beauty in things instead of flaws for a change. You might be a lot happier for it if you did. Anyway, I think that's all from me, folks. I need to rest my throat now. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked what I had to say, please consider liking and subscribing. What did you think of today's topic? Any thoughts, critiques? Please let me know. Stay safe, everyone, and I will speak to you soon. Hopefully when I'm feeling a bit better again. Bye!